Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to see you out here bright and relatively early on this very sunny day. My name is Frances Anderton. I'm a long-time journalist focusing on architecture, design, and to some extent the art world. I've been, I guess, very privileged to support MOCA in organising this series, Art for Earth's Sake, in collaboration with Livia Mandul, sitting right here. So Art for Earth's Sake is a series of 5 conversations. It's part of an initiative that was launched in 2020. That is the founding of the MOCA Environmental Council. This council puts MOCA as being one of the first major museums to actually dedicate resources and attention to the climate crisis and the art world's responsibilities in relation to it. So over this past year, MOCA's been hosting programs, exhibitions, tours, conversations that illuminate various aspects of this crisis that we're facing. And this conversation is part of that. It has been supported, all of this programming has been supported by the Manitou Fund. So this series, Art for Earth's Sake, it consists of 5 conversations during which the art world turns the mirror on itself, as in artists, academics, activists, industry insiders have been considering both the artistic expression of our collective anxieties around the warming planet, but also asking another question, which is what about the carbon footprint of the art world itself? Because after all, the art world, as I think we've all borne witness to, has become a kind of sort of engine in itself. It's just pumped up in terms of prices, in consumption of resources, and even some would argue in being a commodity within late capitalism. So aspects of that have been under discussion over our past three discussions that we've had. Next month, we're going to really get down to brass tacks and literally explore the buildings, the structures that house art and ways in which they might lighten their footprint, museums, installations, art fairs, rushing around the world. And you can come, I hope you'll come back and hear from designers that include Kulapat Yantrasast, Fred Fisher, and some other really interesting names. Today, however, we're taking on what is, I think, arguably one of the really critical issues, actually, within all discussions around the deleterious impacts of not just climate change, but industry in general, industry and development. And that is ways in which neighborhoods in our own region of the Southland are so impacted in very unequal ways by infrastructure, by industry, by development. So today our topic is literally called Dirty Topic. It's a dirty topic because we're talking essentially about dirt. And we're going to hear from 3 fantastic speakers whose work has addressed the devastating impacts of freeways, of toxic air, water, soil, on communities, oftentimes the poorer communities in Los Angeles, geographically some of those in East and South Los Angeles. We're so honored to be joined by, behind me on stage, Kim Abeles. She explores society, science literacy, feminism, the environment. She creates art projects with science and natural history museums, health departments, air pollution control agencies. I mean, what an interesting diversity of partners. And the National Park Service. For example, if you know her work, you may have witnessed such provocations that she's come up with as her presidential smog plates. You'll hear more about that in a minute. I'm so delighted to welcome Eric Avila. We've known each other for many years. I adore Eric. I learned myself so much from him. He's an urban cultural historian, professor at UCLA, studies the intersections of racial identity, urban space, and cultural representation in 20th century America. He's written multiple papers and books, but one that is a standout relative to this topic, The Folklore of the Freeway, Race and Revolt in the Modernist City. He's opened our eyes to the role of Chicano painters in capturing how Boyle Heights was scythed by freeways. In a short while, we're going to be joined by Maru Garcia. She's a Mexican born LA-based artist and chemist. Fantastic fusion, working across art and science and the environment. She creates installations, performance, sculpture, video, all drawing on her laboratory work and fieldwork tools from her background in plant chemistry. You may, if you follow her work, you may know her vacuoles, which raise consciousness about the potential for bioremediation of lead-contaminated soil at the Exide battery plant in southeast LA. So these are our artists and our scholars, and they are going to be in conversation with Jennifer Swan, reporter I highly admire, got to know through KCRW, and stories that she has done that look at actually that same intersection of art at the convergence with environmental injustice. So I could go on and on. I want to throw it over to these speakers, but I do want to say, if you can, stick around after the talk, go and see the Judith F. Backer, very important artwork that is here for a while. It's 9 panels from her famous collaborative mural, World Wall, a vision of the future without fear. So definitely go and see that in that space there, and stay on also for another program that follows right after this that has some connections in some ways. It's K-Onda, a panel about the new wave of Chicanx artists and creators, and that's part of, dare I say it, the G-Spot, that is going to be a program of music and art and goings on all afternoon. So with that, I am so happy to hand off to Jen and look forward to seeing what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Frances. And thank you to Frances Anderton and Livia Mandul for organizing the series. Thank you to MOCA for having us. Thank you to Eric and Kim for being here, and we'll be joined by Maru in a little bit. She'll make a special entrance later in. But yeah, I wanted to start this panel just by talking about the freeways, which feel so ubiquitous in LA. They feel really inescapable. We probably all took a freeway to get here today in some way. And I feel like it's just become such an ingrained part of life in LA that it's like, we don't really make small talk about the weather because the weather's always the same. It's always like, what freeway did you take? Like, what exit did you get off on? Like, which way did you get here? So why don't you tell us which freeway I'm just kidding. Eric, why don't you tell us, so I've been reading Eric's book, Folklore of the Freeway, and, one of the things that you talk about a lot is this moment in the 1950s in Los Angeles and all over the country when highway construction began, and it really transformed life. And at the time, it was seen as this big feat of engineering and science, and there was so much hope, and I think people had a lot of positivity towards that. So tell us how that all came to be, and why are there so many freeways in East LA in particular?
Great questions. It's a huge topic, and I'll do my best to
It's really, really broad, and I threw a lot
okay.
at you.
That's okay, no problem.
But maybe ground us in the 1950s.
Yeah.
We're in Boyle Heights.
Sure.
What does that look like?
Okay. First off, thank you. Thanks for coming. Thanks, MOCA, Livia, Frances, for bringing me in. Thank you, Jen. Great to be here. The 1950s, I think of as kind of like the heyday of highway construction nationally. But because LA was already kind of taking shape as a suburban city, freeways in many ways kind of complemented but also extended that pattern of suburban development into the valley, into Orange County, into the San Gabriel Valley. And freeways provided that network that supported that ideal of suburban family living. And if you think about the impact of redlining and racial restrictions in suburban development, you'd have to say it really shaped the ideal of the white family suburban development. Redlining, which is a policy that dated back to the New Deal period of the 1930s, really kind of created a racial blueprint for the construction of unwanted infrastructural projects like highways. So if you look at the redlining documents for East Los Angeles and Boyle Heights, for example, it's a very negative portrait of a racially mixed, working class, poor community, essentially defined as a slum by the federal government, and of course by state and local officials as well. So because Boyle Heights had that identity identified as a slum, it was literally recommended as the ideal location for the massive interchanges that connect all of the region's major freeways. So if you think about Boyle Heights, if you know Boyle Heights, or walked or driven through Boyle Heights, there are freeways everywhere. I mean, you're literally in the shadow of a freeway. You're above a freeway, you're below a freeway. Freeways really just tore up the neighborhood beginning in the late 40s into the 1950s and 1960s. So the people of East Los Angeles had to deal with all of this destruction. They protested, but to no avail. The freeways came anyway. And so that's why you have the 10, the 60, the 101, all of the region's freeways intersect, the 5, yes. The layers of intersection are all there. And it wreaked absolute chaos and havoc upon the neighborhood. But again, going back to the racial coding of the federal government in the 1930s vis-a-vis redlining.
Mm-hmm. Right. And you talked a little bit too about this protest against the freeway. Can you talk about what were some of the strategies for protest? I think in your book you wrote about a protest that happened near Hollenbeck Park. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about what that looked like and why it may or may not have? I mean, it obviously didn't succeed in stopping the construction of the freeway, but you also write about other communities that were more successful, that tended to be in whiter, wealthier parts of Los Angeles. Yeah. Can you talk about the contrast there? And
Sure, yeah. No, that was a very, very typical pattern nationally where, poor, working class, racially, ethnically diverse neighborhoods were generally not successful in fighting the freeway and trying to block proposals for highway construction and to save their community. And here in East Los Angeles in the 50s, there were organized protests of again, racially and ethnically diverse community members coming together to organize petition drives, lobby city councilmen, pack city council hearings or planning meetings, writing editorials in local newspapers, just very traditional forms of political protest to mobilize and voice community opposition to not just one, but 6 freeways being built in their immediate vicinity. Didn't work. The freeways came anyway, despite those protests. Now, on the west side in Beverly Hills, there was a plan to build the 2 freeway. For those of you who know the 2 freeway, right, La Cañada, Flint Ridge, going down through Glendale and stops abruptly in Echo Park. Well, that was supposed to extend all the way to Santa Monica, vis-a-vis Santa Monica Boulevard. That was supposed to be the 2 freeway. But the good people of Beverly Hills said, no, we don't want this freeway going through our neighborhood. They lobbied a couple of city councilmen who happened to be living in Beverly Hills as well. And the proposal for that freeway was blocked, was halted. So, there's an instance of how the existing patterns of freeways that were built in LA do reflect the contours of racial and class inequality. Who has the power to stop one freeway versus who does not have the power to stop 6 freeways in their neighborhood. So that's why it's a pain in the ass to drive through West Hollywood to try to get to Santa Monica because there are no freeways, because Beverly Hills was not having it.
Right. And then they, historically protested against the expansion of the Metro rail line, right? Now that's finally happening with the Purple Line extension, but it's interesting how, we could have had a city, right, where there was like a rail line that went through it, and we don't have that either for the same reasons.
Right.
Of protest. And it's interesting too, because I had always wondered why the 2 freeway in Echo Park just kind of like dumps you right out, and it's so abrupt.
Yeah.
And now I know the reason why.
Wasn't supposed to be that way.
Right.
But you can thank a generation of homeowners in Beverly Hills for that development.
Who just so happened to have council members, right, who lived in their neighborhood.
Yes, connections.
Classic. And I wanted to read, some of your writing in this book is really evocative and vivid, and the way you talk about freeways as a kind of violence. So I just wanted to read a passage, and then we will get to how this all relates to art, because you also write really beautifully about how the freeways then are represented and reflected through all these art. So this is a passage from your book. Let's see. You say that 6 freeways bullied their way into Boyle Heights, converging on 2 massive highway interchanges that consumed 10% of the local housing stock. By the late 60s, after the California Division of Highways had completed, you call it an assault on East Los Angeles, freeways dominated the sensory experience of daily life in the nation's largest barrio. The roar of traffic coursing above or below surface streets, the shadows cast by soaring interchanges, the dead ends and circuitous detours, the odor of traffic emissions, and you go on, you describe this scene, and it's so evocative. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the ways that these freeways were shown in art from the time, right? Because they immediately made an appearance.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm grateful to be able to share some images with you. I put together a lot of the images that I talk about in the chapter of the book that you're referring to, and I'm kind of contrasting what I consider to be a dominant perspective of freeways by very well-known, famous, wealthy artists like Julius Shulman. This is Ansel Adams right here, Wayne Thiebaud. These guys woke up one day and said, the freeway, that's an aesthetic inspiration. Let me get in a helicopter and take a picture. Let me paint from my studio in Potrero Hill of the 101 freeway that I can see, from way above up here. And Shulman, in his classic way, kind of really aestheticizes the freeway as a monumental work of art. And I was really struck by that because my grounding, my beginning into this project was from Boyle Heights in East Los Angeles. And there, Chicano artists who took it upon themselves to paint their world, their community, their barrio, because, to them it was beautiful, even though it was ugly too because of things like freeways. Their perspective of the freeway, this is James Doolin. By the way, this image is in the lobby of the Metro Transit Authority, right here somewhere by Union Station. This is the image that Metro has as you enter the building. Again, it's that commanding, almost godlike view of the freeways. And that is just a really sharp contrast to the Chicano perspective of freeways, which is in the shadows, as you'll see in a moment. In the shadows, from the shadows, a perspective that is rooted in the racist policy of highway construction in the 1950s. And if you look at the compilation of Mexican-American Chicano art from the 1970s, which was an art rooted in social protest, an art rooted in political activism, to draw attention to the predicament of what it's like to live in a racial concentration of urban poverty. That is a very, very different perspective of the freeway from people who kind of bore the brunt of highway construction. So here's a map of Boyle Heights, and Boyle Heights is literally strangled by the 10, the 60, the 101, the 5 freeway, and you can see those massive interchanges that really dominate the landscape of Boyle Heights. And then the subsequent images after this, there's an aerial photograph of the East Los Angeles interchange. You can see how it literally divides neighborhoods. I mean, those houses were built in the 1920s mostly, and then that 1950s generation of freeways kind of really just tore right into that neighborhood and bisected that neighborhood. And from this mess of freeways, Chicano artists of the 1970s created their own aesthetic, their own art, documenting the experience of highway construction, the division, comparing it to urban renewal projects like the construction of Dodger Stadium in the Chavez Ravine. This is Judith Baca. That's part of the Great Wall of Los Angeles, which is in the concrete ditch that used to be the Los Angeles River. Talk about infrastructure again. And this is Baca, bringing beauty to an otherwise ugly, urban, desolate space. This is Frank Romero, who grew up in Boyle Heights, was very active in the Chicano movement. And this is his portrait of downtown Los Angeles from Boyle Heights. And there's the freeway between the viewer and the city. And that's what LA looks like looking west from Boyle Heights. This is Carlos Almaraz, who was an associate of Frank Romero's, who had this kind of obsessive view of freeways and their destruction. In his mind, freeways symbolized death and destruction when he was doing this Crash series in the 1980s, early 1980s. There's another Almaraz painting. This is how freeways are not supposed to work. This would not hang on the walls of the Metropolitan Transit Authority. Because it undermines, the work of engineers and their claims to highway safety and technical expertise. So this is a subversive portrait, maybe sarcastic, but it subverts the dominant ideals of freeways as the centerpiece of urban life in our city. This is David Boteo, also Chicano activist in the 70s. This is his portrait of Hollenbeck Park. And this photographer is taking a wedding photo, and he's using that willow tree because there's an ugly freeway behind them. And, I don't know about you, but you don't want to have a freeway in your wedding portrait. So, you make do. You make the best of the available scene to block the unsightliness of the infrastructure. That's what Hollenbeck Park used to look like when it was a tourist attraction in the 1920s and 1930s. But in the 1950s, California divisions of highways went back to those redlining maps and said, look, this is a cheap area of land where we can build our freeways at a cost-effective measure, right? So that's how that freeway ended up. Here's another Boteo painting. Again, this is daily life in Boyle Heights, literally under a freeway. I mean, there are many parts of the community are in the shadows of freeways. So this is my argument in this chapter is that, this was a form of social and political protest. It's a way of saying, we don't want these freeways in our neighborhood. They're toxic, they're dangerous, they divide us, but they're here, and we're gonna make the best of the situation. And art and muralism, I argue, is one way of doing that, but as an expression of dissent and political protest.
Thank you so much. And everyone should definitely check out the Judy Baca show after this. You showed an image of her mural where, families are literally divided on opposite sides of freeways. And I think, you referred to it a lot as a kind of like quarantine, right? So it's like connecting people, but then it's also quarantining different neighborhoods. And so much of your writing has really struck me about, for example, Almaraz's paintings of the car crashes. I think you had this anecdote in your book about how his studio was right on the edge of Echo Park Lake in the 80s, and he recalled just literally hearing like metal crashing at all hours of the night, and it was just like so vivid that was just his experience of daily life in Los Angeles, and just thinking about how all of these areas have changed in the last 30, 40 years, right? And just the fact of building this lake that's now, intersected by all the freeways. Hollenbeck Park is cut by all the freeways, and these are our public spaces, and, that's cutting into green spaces in these public parks as well. Another thing you write about that has really stuck in my head is, and I think this is borrowed from another scholar, is this idea of barrio logos. And I wonder if you can talk about this, because you do cite statistics, too, about, obviously, we know now the harms of living near the freeways. There are studies showing decreased lung capacity, right? Increased chance of autism, I think, among children. And so you were kind of saying that at the time, a lot of these artists had this sense that they were showing in their work of the ways the freeway had impacted their life, even before we had these studies to back it up and say, yeah, it is harmful to live near a freeway.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I as a cultural historian, I turn to art as an important part of the historical record. So in studying, urban development and urban transportation in Los Angeles, art to me is an important resource because it privileges voices that are not heard or known or seen, especially in the planning profession. So, I wrote my book in a way kind of targeting the highway planning and urban planning profession and trying to say, are you aware that there are voices out there, community voices that have been around for decades, that understand, firsthand the toxic effects of living near freeways. And so this body of art that I explore is a body of knowledge. It's a body of community knowledge. And I want planners and city builders and city designers and engineers not just to understand the impact of their work, but to know how to listen to other communities through their means of expression, which, for the Chicano movement in the 1970s, that was art. And so that art, to me, embodies community wisdom, community knowledge, that I think needs to have an amplified or more prominent place in the world of planning and city making.
And I wonder, too, you write a lot about these forms of protest against the freeways, and it does feel like a lot of these images, these artists are kind of reacting to this, injustice that was thrust upon them. And I wonder if maybe this is a good question for you as well, Kim, is, I wonder about these strategies for protest historically in Los Angeles and whether they can apply to other projects now. Maybe there's projects in development. There's a project in my neighborhood in Lincoln Heights where, activists are trying to stop development on a land that had toxic soil because it used to be a laundromat 100 years ago. And so they're trying to stop building there. And so I'm watching these community protests and wondering, are there strategies, are there lessons that we can take from, for example, people in Boyle Heights who protested against the freeways that would apply now, that are maybe less, now these artists are reacting, but what is a way we can be more proactive? I guess I'm wondering if there are projects that you're following, if there's protest strategies that really struck with you for either of you.
Yeah, I think where art becomes a community-based project where you're really working directly with community is probably the most effective. I also often think that when I do workshops with my smog work or other ideas I have about environmental art, the effectiveness is really not so much about the outcome, but the process that we've gone through in terms of conversation. What are the causes? What are the solutions? And it's almost as if visual art is sometimes like this passive experience. You go into a space and you observe this, and if it's environmental or political work, going to see a piece of art compared to bringing people into a workshop experience is what I always call those. I think it's so much more effective. It's like they're proactive then instead of just observing what becomes in a certain way a little bit didactic with some aesthetic thrown in. So I'm always sort of grappling with that. The reason, Jennifer, I was telling you earlier, I was thankful for all your good questions, was that I'm getting ready to do a project at Cal State Sacramento, okay? And often people want me to do workshops, and it wasn't until I was really sorting through all the things you were asking also to Eric that I realized, oh yeah, that's right. I need to have a focal point on what is to be changed here. Mm-hmm. So in other words, like in Boulder, Colorado, we did a project at a middle school. And really what we wanted to accomplish was not only the kids kind of understanding air pollution without getting too freaked out about it, like feeling that they could be an agent for change, but also we just wanted their parents to stop idling their cars when they were waiting for their kids. And some of these, kind of very pointed, specific outcomes for me are the that's where change really can take place in the way that people aren't overwhelmed. I think that's kind of the part of the challenge for any environmental work that, if I say climate crisis, you guys are all freaked out already. And me too. And so what is the way that you can present this stuff and feel like I have some empowerment within me in whatever field I am. You're a writer, also writer as well as a teacher, and each of us have these skills. So, yeah.
Yeah, and Kim, I should give some context to your work as well. I think, you're one of the first artists that I thought of when I was thinking of this idea of the panel of environmental work and work in LA. And I think both your work and Maru's work, who will be joining us in just a little bit, I think it does such a fantastic job of engaging with this topic in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming. I think a lot of times when I think of climate change, and environmental injustice, it just feels like this big global thing that I personally as an individual have no bearing on, and it's just, everything is beyond my means, right? It's this big global issue, and I think your work does such a great job of centering it in LA and visualizing it, and Maru's work does as well. And so I just want to talk a little bit about kind of the origins of your work. You're best known for your Smog Collector series, which you started, I want to say in 1987.
Well, first one in 87, yeah.
In 87, okay.
Yeah.
And so you were living.
Oh, thanks.
That's better. Thank you. You were living and working in downtown LA, right at the Santa Fe Artist Lofts.
Actually, the first one was I lived in the Victor Clothing Building on 2nd and Broadway, where a lot of artists had studios, and I was living there illegally and making art, But,
it's okay then if it's illegal, as long as you're making art.
Yeah, no. But, when I had come to LA, I had come from living in the southeastern Ohio farmlands, and I lived in a grain silo that had been converted to a house, and I wrote a crafts, cookery, and country living book. So in other words, I came from that to LA pretty immediately downtown, and would talk to people at coffee shops and complain about the smog, and they would go, "Oh, that's not smog, that's fog." And I got so frustrated that I did a series that maybe you're asking about, where one day I saw the San Gabriel Mountains north up Broadway, and they were clear as a bell, and I was so startled. I felt like I had a religious sighting or something, and this miracle had happened. So I decided to photograph every day to see when I would see them clearly again, and it took a year and 3 weeks. And I did it from my fire escape out you probably know the Victor Clothing Building very well, and then I made sculptures, and I think we're showing one of them, like mounting all these pictures. But the first Smog Collector was one of the ancillary pieces that I made. Like, how do you sort of describe to something to people that seems like it's not their problem, like it's over there, it's always at another neighborhood, but I'm happen to be standing in a safe spot, And so a lot of the work actually came out of that effort. And so the process is that I make a stencil, and I put them on varying objects and put them on a rooftop, or in that first case on the fire escape. And the smog is very heavy. It's made out of metals, it's made out of small bits of rubber as our tires hit the road, depending on where you live near a factory. But most of it is from emissions from cars, trucks, other vehicles, planes, boats. So it settles, and when the image stencil is removed, it is the Smog Collector image.
And I think some of these works are on display here, but they're just so striking because there's such a contrast. Like, it is literally a form of pigment that stains the paper, literally a stencil. And I love that you put it up on your roof. It's like this kind of performative, like, endurance test to see how quickly and how heavily the smog can collect. I think your origin around this work really struck me too, because I think I've had that experience also of like looking out my window and all of a sudden, I had this experience actually just a couple of weeks ago right after all the rains, where all of a sudden I could see like the Hollywood sign from my house in Lincoln Heights, and I'd never seen it in like 2 years, and I was just like, whoa, the mountain looks so close, and it is really like startling and thrilling to see like the mountains, to see how a city should look when there's not smog right after the rain has cleared. And so I love this idea that you literally, captured the smog and then just you left the stencil out on your balcony every day until you could see the mountains again. And I love all the ways that this work has manifested, right? You have a whole series around this idea of collecting smog. And maybe you can talk about them. One of them too is when you walked from your studio in downtown LA to the San Gabriel Mountains, and you decided that you'd walk until you could see them very clearly, as the crow flies, meaning, you literally walked through people's houses, you knocked on their doors, you went through, you were abutted by freeways probably, and, what was that experience like of being a pedestrian, and why was that important to you to just kind of like walk through LA like that?
Yeah, that's kind of the ultimate pedestrian experience where you just ignore all the infrastructure and the buildings. And, because when I would cut through people's houses, I had to literally, get them to let me do that, right? And I think that sometimes when artists do, it is a performative work. I call it a pilgrimage. I was really so enamored by that square sides and bottom and then the organic top of that mountain wedge that it really became sort of a being for me, right? So that I think when artists do this kind of thing that seems almost impossible that you could go in a straight line through a city, there's kind of this weird determination that is an aura around you or something. And sometimes, mothers would come out and they'd go, honey, you shouldn't be walking in this neighborhood. And, sometimes I would be at a very expensive, huge mansion as I would walk, and I'd think, oh my God, these people are never going to let me in here. And I'd open, some butler actually opened the door. And luckily I saw my friend Arnold Meshi's painting in the foyer. So I was like, oh, that's my friend Arnold's painting. And so it really gave me that invitation to cut through. And, there's that, what's that movie, The Swimmer, with Bruce? I know, it was a lot like that. You guys could check it out. It's where he goes from place to place, but swimming through people's swimming pools, right? Yeah, it's a great metaphor for that. Thanks, Burt Lancaster, yeah. So, for me, it was a lot about, I always think I'm maybe like a Jehovah Witness, like I go door to door and I convince people about air pollution and about the, polluted water and so on. And, but see, that's kind of the most effective thing we do, isn't it? When you're like with a couple people and you're making these discussions about your experiences as was, with the Boyle Heights experience. That was like a neighborhood experience, those changes. Think of the people going through that while that was being built. That's what I was thinking when you were talking, actually. But I think those like intimate exchanges that we make, and art really has the capacity to do that. I think that gives us a moment where we can, like I almost am repeating, where is your strength located? And a moment that we each of us can find that.
Yeah, and I love how much of your, I don't know if my mic is still on, maybe it's not. I'll just shout. Here we go. But yeah, I love you're sort of talking about this experience of just walking through LA. It seems like a lot of your work is centered on this. It's almost like walking is framed as a piece of resistance against the infrastructure, against the freeways that have dominated the city. And yeah, I wonder if you could talk about that as like these small acts of resistance in this way in which it almost feels like your work too is kind of like just showing people that these things that you're experiencing do exist, whether it's collecting the literal smog and visualizing it for people, or showing that, hey, I can walk from this distance to the other and here's how difficult it is. But yeah, talk about these moments of like protest within your work and resistance and how that's kind of fueled your art making and what do you want people to make of that?
I'm thinking again back to pieces I do with either classes or community groups. I've done projects the overarching title is probably plots, where we replot what the boundaries are. We just ignore what is there. And I like the idea of mapping where you just take the map of the topography and you just like forget about all the governmental restrictions that are caused by those boundaries or the freeways, other things like that. And, the plots projects were always like, we're going to divide up your area around your school and and you get this one and you get that one. We kind of redefine who owns it and then you're going to take care of that from now on and the rest of your life. Now, I had parents get really upset with me. I know when I did that, because I guess they didn't want to help their kids or something. But I think this idea that why not have each of us take part in a piece of it, right? Isn't that a fair enough? I mean, isn't that radical right there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it feels like you're really tackling things at a small local level to make them feel accessible.
Yeah, because part of it, the way the art kind of changed with environmental work is that, early on, I guess I saw it as like a critique of people who are causing these problems, right? So the presidential plates came out of that. It's all the presidents from McKinley to Bush with their quotes about the environment and industry. And I left them out longer if their environmental records were bad. So that was accounted for the grades of gray on them and so on. And lately I did the world leaders in smog with all their quotes about that they gave at climate summits. Because, they say all kinds of stuff, right? And then I just wanted to know in their capitals, how's their portrait look when you put the stencil out in Berlin or London and so on. So that kind of criticism, I think there's a definite role for that, but I do see, and hi Maru, Maru's project actually falls into this idea of, well, what are some of the solution things? Like the storm drain dolphin was to teach kids about the storm drain system. And not only about recycling, but you're a consumer. Where are you in this consumption problem of ours? So I think the projects bring out that dialogue, and I'm not generating the dialogue. The people I work with are really, I'm the listening that you talked about.
Hi, Maru. I think this is a great segue into your work, but I just wanted to comment too about your presidential plate series. I love, it started with you did Carter, you did Reagan, and more recently you did a whole series with current politicians. There's a Donald Trump one where I think the quote that he gave was really striking. It was something about, we're going to have the cleanest country in the world, the best country. It was just there's such a humor in your work, I think, because you're also taking these things literally and showing the ways that we talk about our environment. And in that series, too, I was also struck by the way that all the plates looked the same amount of smog was collected. Justin Trudeau, Donald Trump, they were all like heavy smog, and that made me feel kind of like, it made me feel like we maybe talk the talk about the environment, but maybe these politicians' policies aren't reflected in that. And I loved how you showed that so simply and cleverly without kind of hitting you over the head with that.
Add one thing to that?
Yeah, please.
I think it was last year, I was asked to do a project in London, and everybody, responded to those plates. So they said, oh, well, why don't you do Sadiq Khan, who, if he's the mayor. And, I still feel guilt over this, okay? Because he's like a good guy, all right? And he really, his quote that we used really connected social justice with the pollution problem. But the way, after conversations with people, we have to continue to push these politicians. Even the so-called, they're on our side, they need public pressure, because otherwise things just get a little bit like packaged, so you're feeling like something's going to happen. But the real change is like, well, when the kids in Boyle Heights, they talked to the council district, right? Nothing happened. So then they did the strike. So you kind of see how this thing doesn't happen in a day. It just is about like applying pressure all the time, every day.
You're talking about the Chicano moratorium.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. I'll just project. And Maru, I feel like, thank you. I'll take this one. Maru, I want to talk about your work. Maru, a lot of your work has focused on this environmental crisis that's happening very close to where we are now, starting just a few miles south in Vernon and extending all the way through, I think, Huntington Park and Maywood. And, this is the result of a battery recycling plant called Exide. And tell us, there's a lot of different manifestations that this work takes, and I want to get into it all, but first maybe you could sort of give us a background on how you became aware of this site and why you wanted to make work about it.
Sure, and thank you so much for the invitation. Hi, everyone. Sorry that I'm a little bit late, but I made it, and I'm very happy, very happy to be here with you. And definitely, we can talk about that. And I was like, as I was coming in my way, I was, of course, reflecting on the conversation of what might happen before I was here, and talking about highways, talking about the smog. Now let's talk about lead. And this is a contaminant and a reality that a lot of people are facing currently. So I'm from Mexico. For the ones that you don't know, I arrived 5 years ago to the city. So I was very new, and I was like seeing everything with this outsider eyes. And I remember at that time I was at UCLA studying an MFA program, and my idea was to start with my work at this intersection of art, science, and environment. And I remember I was taking this class in the engineering department about remediation, and one assignment was, okay, go outside and see what are the environmental problems that you can encounter. And for me, it was not that difficult to find this situation. Actually, that was one of the first ones that I saw. When I saw the magnitude of, we're talking more than 10,000 properties that are contaminated by lead in their soil, I was shocked. I was like, how can this is a reality? Like, I was like really trying to understand. I got very deep into the research. I started to look first into like the official website that DTSC, which is the governmental part that is in charge of the cleanups, was having. I then went into checking the EJ orgs that are in charge of making accountable the government for this, and it was just starting to see everywhere what can lead me to understand this. So that's how, like, that was my first attempt to see the problem. Another reality that I faced was also that we are in this city, and that was my perception, that everything was like just like in packages. Like I would ask people from the area that I was there in the west side at that time, and I was asking, hey, do you know about Exide, this problem that is happening? No, I don't know. And I was like, really? This has been for a long time, and it's just me that I'm just learning, but this should be something that everyone should know. So that was how I entered. I feel that this situation kind of chose me. I don't know, I felt that it was more like a call for doing something, and through this time, I've been able to learn more about it and to see how the impact of a city that is built for cars, that is just caught by these highways, that is having the impact of smog, is also having the the contamination in the soil. So it's everywhere. It's like air, water, soil, what else, right? So I don't want to start like with the dark part, but basically that was my first introduction, like even like feeling depressed about how is that like the impact that this is on people's health. And yeah, you will see in the images like my first attempts to understand first, like, okay, lead, we have used it for a long time. Humans had used it for a long time for different applications, starting from pipes, even the Romans used it. That's why the name plumbus in like the symbol of lead is Pb. It's being used for that. We used it in paints and as an additive for cars, for gasoline. As pesticide. So eventually it was banned for those uses in the 70s and 80s, but still we use it for car batteries. And if we imagine the amount of car batteries that are required for this city to be moved, you will see the proportions of this. So of course this specific company was doing recycling. And if we think about recycling, we will think of, yeah, that's perfect. That's what we have to do. And I agree. But the recycling should happen in the correct way. And that's something that was not, addressed by the government. Like, there were tons of complaints by the community saying, come on, this is actually affecting our communities, our health. And the city was still, like, with those permissions for this industry to keep working. So, yeah, I don't know if I already answered your question, but that's kind of the introduction for this. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's so telling and frustrating too that, you say that you had just moved here at the time, and when you heard about this, you were asking people who lived in Los Angeles and they had never heard about that. Yeah. And I think it kind of speaks to the way that we are so fractured, whether it's the freeways dividing us, whether it's just like our little kind of bubbles where, as you say, Kim, like we feel like, oh, well, that smog is happening over there. That's not in my neighborhood, and there's this kind of distance between everyone. And so can you talk about your work working with the community, and like what kind of research did you do, what kind of outreach, and then how did that then become the work, which was, you actually took, I think you looked up, what was it, the 29 most contaminated sites in the city, and you sampled soil from each of those sites, and there's a whole process called bioremediation, which is introduces a solution. The work is really, really fascinating, and I think it makes these things really visual in a way that's hard to understand otherwise. You can really connect with it on this literal, like, tangible level of soil that kids play with at the park. So yeah, tell us about like going into the community and how did you engage with it, and how did you decide to then use that work and put it in a gallery?
Sure. Yeah, I feel that it was the continuation of the research. For me, research is what you can find, of course, in sources, and like as I was saying, like reading all these reports and going in databases, but I needed to physically research this. And I went to this area, I went to all these parks. I had a list of parks that I wanted to visit. And at these places, I was also, collecting samples. It was part of this idea of learning what was happening. And you can see here a map of the area that the DTSC calls as the preliminary investigation area, which is not that preliminary because it's actually the area that they are marking. But yeah, this is Vernon is a very industrial city, as you may know. But we have a lot of families and people living around. And it was very shocking to see reality of parks in very industrial zones, children, of course, playing in these areas. And I was like shocked and sad, and I didn't know what to do next. So my first approach was, okay, I have this information, I want to share it. And as an artist, I feel that there's ways in which we can share that. And it's starting a conversation, it's just putting that information there. There is going to happen like in the next slide probably. Here is just like a little bit of the current situation. We are talking about like 10,000 properties. Currently, the cleanup process is going of a little bit more than 4,000. And I just want to speak a little bit of what the government is doing to handle the cleanup, which is after sampling, they will go and like dig the soil of the community member and then dump it into the landfill and then replace it with new soil. So still, we are just like throwing away the problem to another community to be affected. But anyway, so with Playground, that was the first attempt that I had to really start exploring this and sharing this as I was learning. And this is a video installation, which the idea is to really show the current situation of a lot of kids that live in very industrial zones. And part of it was to have the viewer, as they came to the gallery, to face this reality. So we have this projection of this park projected as it was like this swings moving and everything. You had an audio component too. And the idea was to bring the soil to the gallery in a way that the viewer can participate and play in a protected manner. You can see these bags, and the idea was to make this controlled environment so people could manipulate the soil that was there. So this was, of course, kind of a way of confronting ourselves with our own situation that you were mentioning. We sometimes think, oh, that's in another place, that's far from us, but that was like, okay, I want to bring this to you. So after Playground, I kept with that research, and I was like, okay, what can we do? What solutions are there that can help us? So that's how Bacchus bioremediating cultures started, and it was basically starting to learn that there is plants and there is organisms that are capable of remediation, and that's what it's called bioremediation. So I learned about plants that have the capacity to absorb lead through the roots and to contain lead in their organelles, in the cell organelles called vacuoles. So my idea was I was really like inspired by this plants that were capable of like really containing lead, like in a way of kind of like protecting the rest of the organisms around and like keeping it there. And I wanted to do the same. I wanted to encapsulate this lead, and that's how these vacuoles were made, basically taking this contaminated soil and putting it inside of the ceramic pieces, oval-shaped. And each of these vacuoles represented one of the 29 childcare centers, parks, or schools that were the most contaminated by this situation. So the installation was made for people to interact with, and the idea was to have these vacuoles on the ground. People could walk around, and as we are describing the situation and having the presence of these 29 objects in the ground, people were able to see themselves also in this projection. That the idea was to recall what you will see under a microscope. So here, the message that I wanted to share was that as the plants or as other organisms, we can see ourselves also as organisms capable of remediation. So if we can think ourselves of that and less of organisms that are just destroying, and if we can change that in ourselves, I think we can see ourselves in a more powerful way to really start the healing process that is needed. And I think we have another more image of that installation to share, but
And Maru, I was reading, I think it was a talk that you gave with Art in America magazine, and one of the anecdotes that you gave that really struck me was about when you were installing, I don't know if it was this show, but you talked about installing this soil in the gallery and the reaction that you got from people who worked at the gallery or who were in there, who were really just sort of kind of terrified of being near this contaminated soil, and almost like this like revulsion to it. And you mentioned the irony of that, because there's ceramics in the building, there's all these other things that are art making materials that actually do have lead in them, that people don't really think of. And so it just made me think of the context and the site specificity and the ways that people might be averse to going to a certain neighborhood, right? But like in a gallery, they expect something that's a little more sterile or safe. And I wonder if maybe Kim as well, if you could talk about your experiences in the art world. I mean, you're a scientist, Maru, and what has your experience been like working with museums and galleries and the type of work that you do? Is there are gallerists receptive to it? Are people receptive? Like, what kind of reactions have you gotten within that world as opposed to in, science or activism or these other worlds that you straddle?
I think I've seen this change quite a bit over the last 35 years. A couple things come to mind by your question. One is actually at a science museum. I was artist in residence at the California Science Center for a couple years. First, we did water, we did color, like as sort of a focal point of art making. And I used to love to work there and actually keep making art while the shows I had mounted were still there. And I interacted all the time with latchkey kids that always would go to the science center before their parents would come home from work. But a lot of times on Saturdays, parents would see me there, and the kids would gravitate toward me, and the parents would yank them away and say, "We're here to see science, not art." It's like, so I think that's kind of telling, like the distinctions between, and then the art world was kind of like that. Like, was my work too didactic? Was it too political? Was it too much about oil companies, like we talked about?
As we sit here in the Eileen Getty Plaza.
Yeah, so, so I think now I see, like you had asked a question about any artists that I know of that I would suggest, and I was like, oh my God, where do I begin? Because if you want to know more about artists that work with ecology, it's Eco Art Space. Especially during the pandemic, there were so many talks and panels, and I saw so much art from around the world. There is such a strong movement, as you know too, of artists really wanting to find solutions, to talk about the issues on local and global levels. I mean, if you ask me about where a hopeful moment can be, it is really about how much on board artists have gotten on this. And it reminds me, Eric, of what you were saying about the Chicano artists, related to Boyle Heights in East LA. It's like, there's this driving force, and I know everybody is coming along with it, for sure.
Yeah, it's nice. It's nice to hear too, because you've been making this work for decades now, and it seems like in the beginning there was kind of this resistance to it, and you started making this work as a way of showing people, literally, yes, there is smog, and now it seems like there's a broad consensus. Everyone understands that, and now it's about how do we take this work and also find solutions. And I wonder too, Maru, one of the things you said was that when you first started looking into Exide, I think you used the word depressed. This is so depressing, and I wonder, maybe everyone can talk about too, just the ways that you find hope or motivation to continue making this work. How do you not live in a place of? I think once I start thinking about and looking into all of the ways the earth is just so screwed, it can be really depressing. So how do you find your way out of that? And for you, is science and art making a way out? And how do you make that accessible?
Sure. I feel that in my case, it happened by saying, okay, I've been talking about the problem so far, and I've been trying to convince people that this is something happening right now. But I felt that it was something else needed to happen. And that's how I feel that artists, we also, besides talking about problems, we have the capacity to make change. And I feel that my hope comes from action. And I am very happy to now share this other project, Prospering Backyards, which is an evolution of my previous research. And it's, I remember when I finished Bacchios, I don't know, someone invited me to write a blog about like my research and all this 2 pieces I was working. And I remember finishing that blog saying, and I wish that someday I can work with the community to make remediation a reality. So I never thought that anyone will actually read that. But apparently, from Self-Graphics, Marbella Muro reach out and say, Maru, since you want to do that, what if we collaborate and we do something? And so that's how this project started, and it's actually now a beautiful time for me to be directly working with community members that want to develop together a possible solution for remediation. And we are currently working with the Natural History Museum for this. It's an interdisciplinary project. Artists, activists, scientists, they are all coming together to find an alternative. And I feel that this is what brings me hope, community. Like if we can organize ourselves and go towards like finding something that could make change, I feel that that's something that can sustain us. And so far, this project has had that capacity for me and for the other people. I remember a lot of community members that we offer free soil sampling during this year, so people that didn't have access to these tools could learn about that. And a lot of the times people will come to me and say, thank you so much, because I first didn't know that I had lead in my soil, but besides that is the idea that I'm not alone, that I can with more people, I'm not the only one facing this reality, and that we together can work towards finding a solution. So yeah, that would be, in my case, what keeps me motivated.
Yeah, I really love that there's this whole almost like a DIY aspect to what you do. Like on the one hand, you're doing all of this complicated science, but then you're also giving people in communities the tools to say, hey, here's how you can test your own soil, here's how you can protect yourself. And sort of in the absence of a speedy government intervention, it's like we all kind of have to work together and do like triage. I wanted to be careful of our time. We have to wrap up soon. Maybe we have time for a few questions. But I did want to end on you, Eric, and sort of get your sense of this current moment in art, and whether it's about Kim's art or Maru's art, and how that kind of relates to the context of the Chicano activism that you've written about. Is this a hopeful moment for you? And how do you sort of contextualize the history of LA art and what's happening now?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, primarily I'm a historian, so I'm stuck in the past. But you know, there's a tradition, a local tradition of the kind of work that Maru and Kim are doing. The word that I keep using is grounded. It's grounded. It's the opposite of ivory tower. It's grounded in community formation. It's grounded in community history, and it's grounded in the people, right? Most importantly, who make up and define LA's diverse and beautiful communities. So you know, I see this process stretching back into LA's past, and I guess, you know, I want to be the scholar who makes the connections between you know, the work that's being done now, today's crisis with yesterday's crises, and showing that there's a historical dimension to it. I do remain hopeful, but yeah, a lot of this work is depressing. But I think talking about it in these kinds of forums, writing about it, bringing people together through art, through civic dialogue, is where I feel optimistic.
Well, that gives me hope too in a dark time. And I think, you know, Maru, you have this great quote about how you want people to think of themselves as remediators instead of, am I saying that right, or bioremediators? Remediators. Okay, instead of exploitators. And so I think like there's something we can all take with that of like, how can I be less exploitative? How can I be less extractive in my own presence? Thank you so much all for being here. This was fantastic.
Thank you.
Do we have, I know we have to go in, we have to be out of here by 1:30. Do we have time for a few questions? Okay, cool. Does anyone have questions for Eric or Kim or Maru? Yeah, we'll be here. Come check out. Francis, do you have a question?
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
I guess this is probably a question for Eric, actually, which is, oh, hello?
You got it.
Okay, here. But,
Oh.
first of all of you, can you hear me now?
Yeah, keep it close.
So, so interesting, all of you. Thank you just so much. I guess, Eric, this is a question for you, and it really has to do about the time period that you explored through the Chicano painters. At the very same time as the painters you've written about are painting the freeways, mashing through Boyle Heights in the way that you so brilliantly describe. At the same time, we have artists like my fellow countryman, David Hockney, putting LA on the map with his paintings of lovely lives lived in Beverly Hills by art collectors with, their grassy greens and their sprinkler systems, which frankly actually are environmental stories too.
Yes.
But can you speak to that? And
Sure.
sort of, it's actually through your work that you've forced us all to actually look back at that time period and understand LA actually differently through the depiction of art. But back then, David Hockney had kind of captured the LA stories. Can you speak to that?
Well, I think that it's a great point. I think for me, the emphasis on art in Los Angeles, it's too West Side. It's just way too West Side. It's Ed Ruscha and David Hockney and the pop moment and LACMA and UCLA and later the Getty. I think we've been stuck on the West Side for too long in telling the story about LA art. And, in my field, in my little world of scholars, I wanted to be the one to say, like, look, there's so much else going on in Los Angeles at the same time that, Hockney is doing, his portraits of the LA landscape and the built environment. But I would also say that, art within an urban context is produced by inequality, but art also produces inequality as well. And I see that relationship as symbiotic and dialectic. But I no disrespect to Hockney or Ruscha. I love their work. Their work kind of brought me into the study of LA, but we know it and we know that story well. And there's so much more to LA than the Sunset Strip or Mulholland Drive.
Cool. Well, I will be around for a little bit if anyone wants to talk. I don't know if you all will be here. Check out the show. Thank you all so much for spending this wonderful Sunday afternoon with us. And go out into your communities and make art. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.